My name is Rena Harper, and I'm 26 years old. For most of my life, I believed the house my father built was the one place no one could ever take from me. I was wrong. My parents divorced when I was 8. My mother moved to Europe with her new boyfriend, promising she would call every week. At first, she did. Then the calls became monthly, then occasional birthday messages, and eventually nothing at all. After that, it was just Dad and me, in the 3-bedroom house he had built with his own hands. He was a carpenter, the kind of man who could look at a pile of raw timber and already see the finished table inside it. During summers and weekends, I followed him into his workshop. He taught me how to measure twice, cut once, and never hide a mistake beneath cheap paint. When I was 17, Dad met Diane at a community fundraiser. She was recently divorced and had 2 daughters, Melissa, 16, and Jessica, 14. Dad fell for her with an intensity that frightened me. By the time I graduated high school, they were married, and Diane and her daughters had moved into our home. From the beginning, something felt wrong. When Dad was present, Diane spoke to me with exaggerated sweetness. Melissa and Jessica smiled politely and asked harmless questions about school. But the moment his truck disappeared down the road, their expressions changed. Diane began giving me orders, as though I were hired help. Vacuum the stairs before your father gets home. Clean the kitchen. The girls are tired. Move your tools. They make the garage look filthy. Meanwhile, Melissa watched television, and Jessica scrolled through her phone without looking up. I tried to be patient. I told myself they were adjusting. I wanted us to become a real family, because I knew how badly Dad wanted one. But the harder I tried, the more they treated my effort like weakness. After high school, I followed Dad into carpentry. I apprenticed under him, learning cabinetry, framing, restoration, and finish work. Dad and I had always planned for me to join his small business and eventually take it over. I continued living at home while saving for my own place. I paid toward groceries and utilities, handled repairs, and did more than my share of chores. Still, Diane and her daughters treated me like an unwanted guest. They complained about my work boots near the door, the sound of my truck when I returned late from a job, and even the scent of my shampoo in the upstairs bathroom. Whenever I tried to speak to Dad, he gave me the same tired answer. They're still adjusting. Evia. Give them time. But time didn't soften them. It made them bolder. Diane began redecorating the house. Photographs of my mother disappeared first. Then, pictures of Dad and me at fishing trips, school events, and job sites were removed. In their place appeared professional portraits of Diane and her daughters dressed in matching colors. My childhood keepsakes were packed into cardboard boxes and pushed into the garage. Even the pencil marks showing my height at different ages were painted over. One evening, I stood in the hallway staring at the fresh paint where those marks had been. Diane passed behind me and said, the house needed to move forward. I remember thinking that moving forward shouldn't require erasing someone. She even changed the exterior, from the soft blue my mother had chosen to a stark white. Dad hated it. I could tell by the way he stared at the finished walls. But when Diane asked what he thought, he smiled weakly. Looks modern. About 3 years ago, Dad began complaining about back pain. He dismissed it as age and decades of physical labor, but I noticed him moving more carefully. He stopped carrying heavy sheets of plywood alone. Sometimes, when he thought I wasn't watching, he braced himself against a workbench and closed his eyes. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with degenerative disc disease. They warned that it would worsen over time. Dad refused to discuss retirement. This business doesn't stop because my back hurts, he said. Last year, just before Christmas, he fell from a ladder at a job site. The call came while I was installing cabinets across town. By the time I reached the hospital, Diane was pacing near the nurse's station, furious that no one could tell her how long he would be unable to work. Dad needed surgery and faced months of recovery. I took over every active project. I visited job sites before sunrise answered client calls during lunch, handled invoices at night, and still came home to check on him. I was exhausted, but I refused to let his business collapse. Diane appeared concerned, but I soon realized her real fear was financial. Melissa and Jessica, now 24 and 22, still lived at home. Melissa had dropped out of community college and worked part-time at a clothing store. Jessica moved between temporary jobs, never keeping one for long. While Dad was still hospitalized, Diane cornered me near the vending machines. "We need to discuss what happens to the business if your father can't work again. I'll keep it running," I said. "He's trained me for years." Her eyes moved over me skeptically. "We may need to sell it. The money would secure our future." I stared at her. "Dad would never sell. That business is his life." "Lives change," she replied with a shrug. "People have to be practical." What she meant was that my father's legacy mattered less than the money she could extract from it. After surgery, Dad pushed himself too hard. Physical therapy left him pale and shaking. Simple movements became humiliating battles. I continued managing the company, often working 14-hour days. 3 months later, I returned home late after finishing built-in bookshelves for the Morrison family. I was tired, hungry, and carrying Dad's favorite takeout as a surprise. When I entered, Diane, Melissa, and Jessica were seated at the dining table with him. Dad looked uncomfortable. His shoulders curved inward. "Where have you been?" Diane demanded. "We've been waiting to discuss family matters." "I was finishing the Morrison project." I set the food on the counter. "What happened?" Diane exchanged a glance with her daughters. "We've been discussing the future of this household. Your father's condition has created financial pressure. The business is doing well." I said, "I kept every client and brought in 2 new contracts. That's not enough." Melissa interrupted, twisting a strand of hair around her finger. "Mom deserves better than scraping by on whatever you bring in." I looked at Dad. "What is this really about?" Before he could answer, Diane leaned forward. "We're renovating. The garage will become a master suite for your father and me. The girls will take the upstairs bedrooms." I frowned. "I already have one of those bedrooms." Silence settled over the table. Then Diane said it with chilling calm. "We'll take your room and ask you to leave. You're 26. It's time you stopped depending on us." Melissa smirked. "We need the space more than you do." Jessica folded her arms. "You're barely here anyway." I waited for Dad to defend me. I waited for him to remind them that I was keeping his company alive, paying bills, driving him to appointments, and protecting everything he had built. He stared at his plate. That silence hurt more than Diane's words. I ate without tasting anything. Later, I lay awake in the bedroom they had already decided belonged to someone else. I kept hearing Dad tell me to give them time they had been given years before sunrise. I called Uncle Robert, Dad's older brother and former business partner. They had fallen out after Robert warned him that Diane wanted his house and money. When he answered, my voice almost broke. "Uncle Robert. It's Rena. I need your help." 2 hours later, I was sitting in his kitchen, telling him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, his expression had gone cold. I knew Diane was trouble. He said, "But your father allowing this after everything you've done is something else. I can't stay there." I whispered, "But leaving means walking away from the business I spent years building." Robert studied me for a moment. "I need someone to manage my custom cabinetry division. Good salary. Full authority. And I have a rental house you can use." I stared at him. "Are you serious?" "Completely. You're talented, reliable, and more patient than either your father or I ever deserved." Relief rushed through me so suddenly that my eyes burned. "Thank you. Start Monday," he said. Then his expression sharpened. "And Rena, let me help you move properly. Diane wanted you gone. We're going to make certain she understands exactly what that means." When I returned home that afternoon, Diane was shopping with Melissa and Jessica. Dad was asleep in his recliner, the television murmuring softly in the background. I stood there for a moment, Looking at him, he seemed smaller than I remembered. The man who had once carried cabinets up staircases, without asking for help, now slept with a heating pad, pressed against his back. Part of me wanted to let him rest. Another part knew that if I delayed, I might lose the courage to say what needed to be said. I touched his shoulder, gently. Dad. Wake up. We need to talk. His eyes opened slowly. What's wrong? Evie. I heard what Diane said last night. About taking my room and throwing me out. His face tightened with shame. She didn't mean it that way. She said it clearly. She's under pressure. We all are. I stared at him, waiting for something more. An apology. Anger? Any sign that he understood how deeply he had failed me. Instead, he looked toward the television. I sat across from him. I have been running the business alone for months. I kept every client. I finished your contracts. I paid my share of the bills and covered extra expenses when things got tight. I drive you to therapy when Diane is busy. Then, I sat at that table while they spoke about me like I was dead weight. And you said nothing. His hands gripped the arms of the chair. It isn't that simple. It is simple. You were my father before you were Diane's husband. That's unfair. No. Daj. What was unfair was making me earn my place in the house where I grew up. His face flushed. Diane loves me. Maybe she does. But she doesn't respect me. And last night, neither did you. He flinched as though I had struck him. I took a breath. I'm leaving. His eyes widened. Leaving the house? The house and the business. He pushed himself upright too quickly and winced. What about the current projects? I arranged for the Wilson brothers to take over. They have detailed notes, schedules, supplier contacts, and client requirements. The books are current. You did all that already. Yes. Where are you going? Uncle Robert offered me a job managing his cabinetry division. He also has a rental property. I can stay in. Dad's expression darkened instantly. You went to Robert behind my back. I went to the only person who listened. You know what happened between us? I know he warned you about Diane. And you stopped speaking to him because you didn't want to hear it. That is not the whole story. Maybe not, but he still showed up for me when you didn't. The anger drained from Dad's face. What remained looked like fear. Evie. Please. I know things have been difficult. But we can fix this. I shook my head. You had years to fix it. I'll talk to Diane. You always say that after the damage is done. His voice softened. The business was supposed to be yours. And yet the moment Diane suggested selling it, you never told her no. I was recovering from surgery. You were sitting at the table last night. The words landed between us. Dad looked down at his hands. I never wanted you to feel unwanted. But I did. I stood. I'm moving tomorrow morning. Upstairs. I began packing. Every object carried a memory. The small wooden plane Dad gave me when I finished my first cabinet. The framed photograph of us standing beside the workshop on my 18th birthday. My mother's old scarf. One of the few things Diane had missed when she erased her from the house. I packed until my eyes blurred. Hours later, I heard the front door open. Diane's voice floated through the hallway, followed by Melissa complaining about shopping bags, and Jessica asking what was for dinner. Then Dad told them I was leaving. The house erupted. What do you mean? She's leaving, Diane demanded. Who is going to run the business? Melissa asked. Jessica's voice rose above the others. What about Dad's appointments? Not one of them asked where I would go. Not one asked whether I was hurt. They were only afraid of losing what I provided. The next morning, I woke before dawn and carried the last boxes to my truck. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. Dad stood on the porch, wearing a jacket over his pajamas. He looked older than 55. You don't have to do this, he said. Yes, I do. Your room is still yours. Only because I'm leaving before they can take it. He stepped toward me. I should have defended you. The admission came too late. But it still hurt. Yes, I said. You should have. His eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. I believe you're sorry. I just don't know yet whether that changes anything. The first glow of sunrise appeared over the rooftops, then came the sound of engines. One vehicle turned onto our street. followed by another, then another, 3 moving trucks, 2 vans, and several pickup trucks rolled toward the house, each marked with Uncle Robert's construction company logo. Dad stared in confusion. Diane burst through the front door, wearing a silk robe. What is going on? Melissa and Jessica appeared behind her. The convoy stopped along the curb. Workers climbed out, carrying tool belts, dollies, and labeled inventory sheets. Uncle Robert stepped from the lead truck with a clipboard in his hand. Morning, Diane. Her face stiffened. Robert, what are you doing here? Helping my niece move out. As requested, he gestured toward the trucks. You wanted her gone. We thought we'd make the process efficient. Diane looked from him to me. All of this is for Rena's boxes, not only her boxes. At Robert's signal, the workers moved toward the house. 2 entered through the front door. Others headed toward the garage and workshop. Diane stepped into their path. Wait, what are they doing? Removing property that belongs to Rena. They cannot just walk into my house. Robert's expression remained calm. It isn't your house. The color drained from her face. What did you say? He handed her a copy of a document, the original deed. My brother built this house with our father, before he ever met you. Daniel owns it outright. Diane scanned the page, her hands beginning to tremble. We're married. That does not place your name on the deed. She turned toward Dad. Daniel. Dad said nothing. Diane looked back at Robert. There was no prenup. No. Robert said. But there was also no transfer of ownership. Workers began carrying furniture toward the trucks. Diane's eyes widened. What are they doing with the dining chairs? Taking Rena's property. They are ours. I stepped forward. No. I built them during my apprenticeship. The lumber was purchased through the business, and the records are still in the company files. A worker placed a label on the dining table. Diane gripped its edge. You are not taking this. That table is mine too. I said. I designed it when I was 19. Melissa appeared at the top of the stairs. Mom. They're taking the hallway cabinet. I made that for Dad. I said. Jessica rushed from the bedroom. They moved my mattress. Robert checked his clipboard. The bed frames were handcrafted by Rena and stored here until she moved into her own place. Jessica's face twisted. But where are we supposed to sleep? The question was so familiar that I almost laughed. Yesterday, she had not cared where I would sleep. Robert looked at her evenly. That sounds like something your mother should have considered before deciding Rena contributed nothing. Diane spun toward Dad. Stop them. Dad's face was pale. Diane. Maybe we should let Robert explain. Explain what? That your daughter is stealing from us. I opened the folder I had carried from my room. This is the partnership agreement Dad and I signed when I turned 21. I own 49% of the business, with the option to purchase an additional 2% when he retires. Diane stared at me. You never told me that. You never asked how the business actually worked. You only asked how much it was worth. Melissa came downstairs, her face red. Mom said the business would be sold. That was never her decision. Diane looked at Dad. You told me we would discuss selling? Dad's eyes narrowed slightly. I said we would discuss the future. I never agreed to sell. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Diane's face. Robert turned another page on his clipboard. The workshop tools are either company property or Rena's personal equipment. Several appliances were purchased through the business because the house was occasionally used for client meetings. The lawyers have reviewed the records. Lawyers, Diane whispered. Robert nodded. Everything has been documented. The workers continued methodically. A hand-crafted coffee table left the living room. Shelving disappeared from the study. Lamps, cabinets, and storage units I had built over the years were carried toward the trucks. With each item removed, the house looked less polished and more hollow. Diane's anger sharpened into panic. You planned this. I planned to protect what was mine. I said, you're punishing us because we asked you to grow up. No. I'm leaving because you told me I had no place here. I'm simply refusing to leave my work behind for people who never valued it. Melissa turned toward Dad, suddenly softening her voice. Dad, are you really going to let them do this to us? It was the first time I'd heard her call him Dad. The manipulation was so obvious that even Daniel seemed to hear it. He looked at her. Then at Jessica. Then at Diane. His expression slowly changed. "I think," he said carefully, "I need to speak with my wife alone." Diane stared at him. "Daniel, don't start this now." "No," he said, firmer this time. "Now may be exactly when we need to start." Robert nodded. "That's fair. The workers will continue with the inventory." Diane followed Dad into the kitchen. But their voices soon rose behind the closed door. "I gave up everything for you," she shouted. Dad answered, in a voice I could not fully hear. Then Diane screamed, "She is turning you against your own family." I froze beside the truck. For years, I had been told to be patient so they could become my family. No. When I finally left, Diane spoke as though I had never belonged to it. Before the last truck was loaded, I found Dad standing alone near the workshop. "The Wilson brothers have everything they need," I said. "The business accounts are organized. Client deposits are documented." He nodded, without looking at me. "I never understood how much you were carrying. You never asked." His eyes were damp. "I was afraid of losing Diane. And while you were protecting that marriage, you lost me." His face crumpled. "I don't want that." "Then, you'll have to decide what you're willing to do differently." He looked toward the stripped-down house. "Where will you stay?" "At Robert's rental for now. I start Monday." He always did have an eye for talent. "So, did you once?" Dad gave a broken smile. "You're better than I ever was. I had a good teacher. Despite everything." I meant it. When the last box was secured, I climbed into my truck. Diane stood on the porch with Melissa and Jessica. Their anger had faded into stunned disbelief. They had wanted me gone. They had simply never imagined how much would leave with me. Robert approached my open window. "Ready." I looked once more at the house where I had grown up. Dad stood in the driveway, alone between two families. Finally seeing the cost of choosing silence, I started the engine. "Ready." As the convoy pulled away, I watched him in the rearview mirror until the house disappeared behind the curve. I felt grief. But beneath it was something stronger. Freedom. What I didn't know then was that the empty rooms would force Dad to confront far more than Diane's greed. Within weeks, he would uncover the one decision she had made behind his back that even I had never suspected. The first few days after leaving felt strangely quiet. For years, my mornings had begun with phone calls from clients, schedules packed with job sites, and the constant tension of wondering what mood waited for me at home. Suddenly, I woke in a small rental house, surrounded by silence. It should have felt lonely. Instead, it felt peaceful. On Monday, I started managing Uncle Robert's custom cabinetry division. The workshop was larger than anything Dad and I had ever operated. Skilled carpenters filled the building, each specializing in different aspects of the craft. Robert introduced me not as his niece, but as the woman who would be leading the division. "You'll answer to Rena," he told everyone. "She's earned this position." No one questioned him. No one treated me like I had something to prove simply because I was family. The respect was immediate, and I realized how long I had lived without it. Managing larger commercial projects challenged me in ways I hadn't expected. I still spent time in the workshop whenever possible, but I also learned budgeting, staffing, supplier negotiations, and long-term planning. Every evening I drove home tired. But for the first time in years, it was the satisfying exhaustion that comes from meaningful work rather than emotional survival. The rental slowly became my home. I unpacked the furniture I had built over the years. The dining table fit perfectly beneath the kitchen window. The handcrafted bookshelves lined one wall of the living room. The bed frame Jessica had claimed as hers finally stood in the bedroom it had always been intended for. Each piece reminded me that I hadn't left empty-handed. I had carried years of my own work with me. About a month later, I met Ethan. He owned a local landscaping company and had hired Robert's business to build custom outdoor cabinetry for a high-end client. Unlike most people, he didn't seem impressed by titles or ownership percentages. Instead, he admired craftsmanship. "I've never seen dovetail joints this clean," he said while examining one of my cabinets. I laughed. That's probably the nicest compliment anyone has ever given me. It wasn't a compliment. He smiled. It was professional admiration. Our conversations became coffee. After meetings, coffee became dinners. Dinners slowly became something much more meaningful. Ethan never tried to rescue me from my past. He simply respected the woman standing in front of him. It was exactly what I hadn't realized I needed. Dad called for the first time, 3 weeks after I moved. The conversation was awkward. He asked about work. I asked about physical therapy. Long silences settled between us. When we hung up, neither of us had mentioned Diane. But the calls continued. Little by little, they became easier. One afternoon, almost 2 months after I left, Dad asked if we could meet for lunch. We chose a small diner, halfway between our homes. When he walked inside, I immediately noticed the difference. He looked healthier, still tired, still recovering, but lighter somehow. After we ordered, he folded his hands together. I owe you an apology. I stayed quiet. I kept convincing myself that keeping the peace was protecting everyone. He looked down. Instead, I protected the wrong people. I didn't interrupt. Diane became angry after you left. He gave a bitter laugh. At first, she blamed you for everything. Then she blamed Robert. Eventually, she started blaming me. What changed? I started paying attention. He rubbed his forehead. Without you there, I noticed things I'd ignored for years. He described arguments over money, credit card balances he hadn't known existed, expensive purchases hidden from him, Melissa and Jessica refusing to work while demanding more financial support. Then, he paused. I also discovered Diane had already spoken with a real estate agent about selling the house. I looked at him in surprise. You never agreed to that. No. He shook his head. She assumed she could convince me once I retired. The realization had finally broken whatever illusion remained. I filed for divorce. The words hung quietly between us. I didn't celebrate. I simply nodded. I figured, I should have listened to Robert years ago. You should have listened to yourself. He smiled sadly. That's probably true. A few weeks later, he called again. The house is going on the market. I wasn't expecting the ache that settled in my chest. That house had been my childhood. It held every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every lesson Dad had ever taught me in the garage workshop. But it had also become the place where I learned how easily silence could become betrayal. Sometimes memories and pain occupy the same address. Selling the house felt like saying goodbye to both. Not long afterward, Dad visited my rental for the first time. He walked slowly through each room. His eyes stopped at the dining table. You kept it beautiful. I always intended to. He ran his fingers across the smooth surface. I remember when you made this. You complained I sanded it too much. He laughed softly. I was wrong. You usually were. We both laughed. It was the first conversation we'd shared in years that didn't feel heavy. Before leaving, he stood on the porch. I've been thinking about something. What? The business? I waited. It was always supposed to become yours. He swallowed. I lost sight of that. I looked at the man who had taught me everything about carpentry. For the first time in years, he wasn't asking me to sacrifice. He was admitting his mistake. I'd like you to come back. His voice carried hope. We could rebuild it together. I looked toward Robert's company truck, parked in my driveway. I can't answer today. I understand. Robert stood beside me when I had nowhere else to go. Dad nodded slowly. I know. I won't abandon him the way I felt. Abandoned? I wouldn't ask you to. He reached into his pocket. I only wanted you to know. The door is open. After he left, I sat on the porch until sunset. Part of me wanted everything to return to the way it had once been, but another part knew that person no longer existed. Healing doesn't erase history. It teaches you how to carry it differently. Over the following weeks, Dad continued rebuilding his relationship with Robert. The brothers who had barely spoken for years slowly found common ground again. Robert never gloated. He simply accepted Dad's apology and reminded him that families survive only when pride steps aside. As for Diane, I heard she, Melissa, and Jessica had moved into a small apartment across town. The expensive lifestyle they had fought so hard to protect disappeared almost overnight. Occasionally, someone from town mentioned seeing Melissa working full-time. or Jessica finally keeping a steady job. I didn't feel satisfaction, only distance. One afternoon, while driving home from a client meeting with Ethan, I passed my childhood house. A large for sale sign stood in the front yard. I pulled over for a moment. Fresh paint covered the porch. The garden had been trimmed. The windows reflected the afternoon sun, exactly as they had when I was 8 years old. It looked like the same house, but it no longer held the same life. I smiled softly before driving away. Some chapters don't end because the building disappears. They end because the person living inside finally changes. Looking back now, I realize the morning Uncle Robert arrived with those moving trucks wasn't the day I lost my home. It was the day I stopped begging for one. I lost a house, but I found peace. I lost the illusion that love always protects you, but I gained relationships built on honesty and respect. Most importantly, I learned that self-respect is never something another person gives you. It's something you choose, even when that choice hurts. Maybe one day, Dad and I will build something together again. Maybe we won't. Either way, we finally understand each other, and that's a stronger foundation than any house we could ever build. With wood,